Tonight, we drift backward, past the hum of streetlights and the comfort of thermostats, past the age of therapy, the age of science, the age where we think we understand what a child needs. We're going back to a century cloaked in soot, silence, and neglect, to a time when childhood was not protected, but institutionalized. This is not a story about kings or warriors. It's not about battles or monuments. It's a story about those history forgot to mention. Children who vanished inside stone walls. The boys and girls who were called mad, imbecile, feeble-minded. Children who were not held or healed, but hidden. Locked away in buildings meant to treat the mind, but never designed for theirs. The forgotten children of Victorian asylums. Before the 19th century, mental illness in Britain was a problem most families handled in secret. The wealthy kept their disturbed relatives in private rooms, attended by servants and physicians. The poor had no such option. They turned to parish poorhouses, to local jails, or left their mad relatives to wander. Madness in that era was not a medical issue, it was a social stain. The insane were often jailed, chained, or beaten. No separation was made between the criminal, the drunk, and the mentally ill. Children who screamed or hit their siblings might be tied to a bed. Girls who talked to themselves could be whipped. Boys who failed to learn might be sent to workhouses. There were no special schools, no understanding of childhood trauma, no labels like autism, PTSD, or schizophrenia, only idiot, imbecile, or dangerous. Then came the madness of King George III. The public watched as the monarch raved in private chambers. He was restrained, bled, and declared unfit to rule. His condition became a national obsession. If madness could reach the throne, perhaps it could reach any home. The incident sparked a shift in public consciousness. In 1808, the British Parliament passed the County Asylums Act. It allowed, but did not require, counties to establish asylums for pauper lunatics. For years, few counties acted. The stigma of insanity was too great. The cost of building asylums was steep, but pressure mounted from reformers and coroners, from clergy and civic leaders. Reports of abuse, of patients dying in chains, of children starving in workhouse basements circulated widely. In 1845, Parliament acted again, this time with force. The Lunacy Act and a revised County Asylums Act made it mandatory for all counties in England and Wales to provide asylum accommodation. A new National Lunacy Commission was formed. Inspectors were appointed, and the asylum boom began. From Yorkshire to Cornwall, great stone institutions rose from the countryside. Hanwell, Colney Hatch, Lancaster Moor, designed to isolate the insane from society, and from each other. The design was methodical. Long corridors, symmetrical wards, locked doors, airing courts, dormitories, churches, gardens for the calm, isolation rooms for the wild. These were not places of healing, so much as containment. The idea was not to cure, but to manage. What the Victorians called moral treatment meant imposing order. A person overwhelmed by inner chaos, they reasoned, might find peace through routine. Wake up, bathe, eat, march, work, rest, obey, repeat. Many asylum superintendents believed in this philosophy. Some genuinely hoped to help, but the system grew too large too quickly. Funding lagged, staff were poorly trained, wards became overcrowded, and no one, not a single founder or commissioner, planned for children. The asylums were built for adults, for those considered incurably mad. The idea that children might need something different, a school, a playroom, a teacher, was not even discussed. And yet, children came. They came through the courts, through the workhouses, through families that could no longer cope. They came labelled idiots and imbeciles. Some had epilepsy, others had been abused, some had been born with cognitive impairments, others were likely neurodivergent in ways we recognise today. But once inside the asylum, all were treated the same. They were stripped of personal belongings, assigned uniforms, housed in adult wards. Some children were isolated for crying, others were beaten for speaking out. There were no toys, no books, no schooling. If a child lashed out, it was punished. If a child was quiet, it was ignored. The Victorian ideal of childhood, as a time of innocence, of moral and emotional development, had no place here. These children were not considered children, they were inmates. A commissioner's report from 1865 observed, "It is a painful thing to see idiot children wandering, without special care, about the wards of a lunatic asylum." But still, no change came. Why not? Because it was cheaper. Building new institutions for children was expensive. Training specialists cost money. Reforming the education system meant political battles. Asylums were already funded, and they had space. So when a family couldn't manage, when a parish wanted to remove a burden, when a workhouse found itself with a child no one could handle, the asylum was the path of least resistance. The result was silence. Institutional silence. Children locked behind iron doors, sleeping beside adults in psychosis, wandering barefooted across stone floors. One report described a 5-year-old girl who self-harmed, attacked other inmates, and was tied down for days. Another described a 12-year-old boy who tried to hang himself with a bedsheet. These were not isolated cases. They were common, and as the asylum population grew, the proportion of child inmates quietly rose. By 1900, more than 100,000 people were confined in British asylums, among them thousands of children. No system tracked them. No reforms prioritized them. The ones who died were buried on site. The ones who survived often stayed until adulthood, forgotten by their families, faded into the record books. And yet the system continued to call itself progress. The buildings were clean, the routines were strict, there were chapels and gardens, but none of it was designed for the children within. The architecture of the asylum, its laws, its funding, its logic, had a fatal flaw. It never imagined that the mind of a child might require something more than silence and walls. This is the origin story of the Victorian Asylum, a story built not from cruelty, but from a mission, not from hatred, but from institutional blindness. The system worked for those it was designed to manage. Everyone else, especially the youngest, was collateral. And so we begin with bricks and laws, with intentions that paved the way for isolation, with progress that built beautiful buildings and filled them with pain. The next chapter in this story, it's in the legislation, in the ink that turned misbehaviour into diagnosis and difference into a crime, because what came next were the laws that locked the nursery door. In the Victorian world, laws were the scaffolding of society. They shaped its buildings, its punishments, its hopes. They told people where they could live, how they could die, and in the case of thousands of children, whether they would be locked away for life. To understand how so many children came to be institutionalized in asylums, we must trace not just their footsteps, but the legislation that carved the paths beneath them. The roots of asylum law in Britain begin with hesitation. Before the 19th century, there was no standardized system for dealing with the mentally ill. Care was local, scattered, and improvised. The wealthy hired doctors and nurses to manage their mad relatives at home. The poor depended on parish workhouses or prisons. Madness, in legal terms, was simply a nuisance, a problem to be contained, not solved. But as madness became more visible, more public, and more associated with social instability, the state began to respond. The first major legislative milestone was the 1808 County Asylums Act. It didn't compel counties to build asylums, but it allowed them to, for the first time, using public funds. This law marked a quiet shift in the government's posture. It acknowledged that insanity was no longer a purely private matter. It was now a public concern. Still, few counties responded. Without obligation, they saw no urgency. The insane remained scattered, some at home, some in cells, many in workhouses where they lived and died without record. But over the next decades, pressure built. Reformers published exposés on asylum neglect. Coroners complained of madness-related deaths in local lockups. The clergy wrote sermons on the moral duty to care. Parliament listened. In 1828, the Madhouses Act attempted to regulate private institutions. It created inspection regimes, limited overcrowding, and mandated record-keeping. It was a start, but most pauper lunatics were still not in licensed madhouses. They remained wherever space could be found. By the 1840s, the patchwork system was failing. Then came 1845, a pivotal year. Parliament passed 2 laws, a new Lunacy Act and a revised County Asylums Act. Together they transformed the landscape. Now counties were no longer permitted to build asylums, they were required to. A centralised lunacy commission was formed. Inspectors were sent out. Commissioners began collecting data on inmates, their diagnoses, their behaviour, their length of stay. For the first time, the state was building a national mental health infrastructure, but it was built for adults. No one asked what should happen to a child who didn't speak, who had fits, who screamed at night or refused to sit still in class. When such children appeared in parishes or courtrooms, they were assigned the same legal labels as adults: idiot, imbecile, lunatic. These were not metaphors. They were categories embedded in the law. An idiot was someone deemed mentally incapable from birth. An imbecile was considered less impaired, but still deficient. A lunatic was someone who had once been sane, but lost that stability. These terms appeared in every statute. They defined who could be institutionalized, who could be removed from school, who could be denied inheritance, contracts, or freedom. Children, as it turned out, fit easily into these categories, too easily, and so they were swept in. A 6-year-old girl who refused to speak might be declared an idiot. A boy with seizures became an imbecile. A teen who ran away from home, shouted obscenities, or drew strange pictures, lunatic. Once labelled, a child could be institutionalized by magistrate order, family petition, or poor law board. There were no psychological assessments, no child advocates, no clear pathways for appeal. For many families, especially the poor, asylum commitment was the only option. If a child could not attend school, could not work, and was disruptive at home, the asylum became both a medical and economic solution. Once inside, legal inertia took over. The law allowed for confinement, but it rarely provided a way out. As the system expanded, new laws followed. The Idiots Act of 1886 marked a turning point. It was the first time British law formally separated idiots and imbeciles from the insane. This distinction mattered. It shifted the legal understanding of these children. They were no longer considered mentally ill in the psychiatric sense, but rather deficient in capacity, and thus in need of control, education, or supervision. The law paved the way for specialised institutions, idiot schools, training colonies and custodial homes, but these were few and underfunded. In practice, many so-called defective children remained in asylums. The next legal milestone came in 1899, the Elementary Education, Defective and Epileptic Children Act. For the first time, local education authorities could remove children from mainstream classrooms and place them in special schools. The language was paternalistic. Defective children were seen as unteachable, disruptive, or dangerous. Their removal was framed as protection for them and for other students. Again, the law created permission, not provision. Few special schools were actually built. As a result, many of these children were routed directly into institutions, out of classrooms, into wards. The 1913 Mental Deficiency Act took things further. It codified categories of mental deficiency into law: idiots, imbeciles, feeble-minded, and moral defectives. This last term applied to children and teens who showed antisocial behaviour, including petty crime, sexual precocity, or defiance. The state now had the authority to detain them not for illness, but for their perceived moral risk. Under this act, children as young as 7 could be institutionalised indefinitely. The new law created a board of control to oversee institutions and placements. It also allowed for the establishment of colonies, large, often rural facilities designed to house the mentally deficient away from cities, schools, and society. Legal responsibility for these children was passed between agencies, education departments, poor law boards, asylum inspectors. No single system was responsible, no one kept a central record, and so children became paperless ghosts, moved from court to workhouse to asylum with little oversight. The language of the law disguised its brutality. Children weren't abandoned, they were committed. They weren't imprisoned, they were placed. They weren't silenced, they were reassessed. Behind those words were thousands of lives. Children who spent their entire adolescence institutionalized for stuttering, for running away, for being hard to teach. Children who died unnamed in asylum cemeteries. Children who were never told why they were there or how long they would stay. The law did not begin this system in cruelty, but it sustained it in blindness. By drawing legal lines around categories like idiot or defective, it created pathways to confinement without pathways home. By giving officials power without accountability, it created institutions that could grow unchecked. By calling difference a deficiency, it allowed society to forget these children were still children. It would take decades into the late 20th century for these laws to be dismantled, renamed, reformed. But for much of the Victorian era, and well into the early modern one, the legal system was not a shield for vulnerable children. It was a gate, and once it closed behind them, few ever walked free again. In the Victorian asylum system, few children arrived by a single road. There was no uniform intake form, no child-focused department, no centralised system watching over their arrival. Instead, they slipped in through the cracks. Through courts, poorhouses, orphanages, workhouses and homes. They came from everywhere and from nowhere, but almost none of them came with a plan. Understanding how children ended up in asylums means examining the pipeline, the unseen machinery that swept them off the streets, out of homes and into institutions. It wasn't always intentional. It was often a tangle of poverty, stigma, bureaucracy, and neglect, but it was remarkably effective. Sometimes the story began with a diagnosis, but more often it began with a label. A child who didn't speak, who rocked back and forth, who flinched at touch or whimpered through the night, was called defective. A boy who struggled in school, who refused to sit still, who hit his classmates or soiled himself, was an imbecile. A girl who screamed, who spoke to herself, who wandered barefoot through the market, was mad. The language wasn't medical, it was social, and it was binding. Once that label was spoken by a parent, a teacher, a local official, the system began to move. If the family was poor, the first stop was often the workhouse. Meant originally as a place of temporary refuge, workhouses in Victorian Britain became sprawling institutions of their own. Families entered out of desperation when they couldn't feed their children, or care for a disabled son, or manage a daughter with epileptic fits. They turned to the state, and the state answered with confinement. Inside the workhouse, children who didn't fit in, who disrupted routines, who screamed through the night, who injured others or themselves, were quickly marked for removal. Workhouse masters didn't want to manage the mentally ill. They didn't have the training, they didn't have the patience, and so they wrote to the Board of Guardians or the local magistrate requesting a transfer. Some children were sent straight to the asylum. Others were evaluated by visiting doctors, men who often spent less than 5 minutes with them and whose opinions were rarely questioned. Once declared insane or idiotic, the paperwork began. In other cases, the entry point was the courtroom. Victorian Britain criminalised behaviours it did not understand. A child who stole food, who broke a window, who shouted obscenities in public, might be arrested. If that child showed signs of instability, or couldn't answer questions properly, or failed to understand the charges, they might be deemed unfit for prison and sent to the asylum instead. There was no juvenile justice system, no therapeutic courts. A troubled child was either a criminal or a patient. Often they were both. For orphaned children, the path could be even simpler. If a boy or girl had no one to care for them and showed signs of emotional or behavioural difficulty, guardianship authorities could place them wherever there was room. If schools refused them, if foster care failed, if reformatories found them too challenging, they were declared defective and sent to the asylum. In rare cases, children came from private homes. Middle-class or even wealthy families, shamed by their child's behaviour, sought to remove them from public view. A daughter who expressed sexual curiosity, a son who refused to speak, a child who embarrassed the family at church or disrupted the hired help. These children were sometimes sent to private asylums, where families paid for silence, but not always. When the money ran out or the child became too difficult, they were transferred to public institutions. One particularly harrowing account tells of a young girl, admitted in 1872, whose family claimed she was dangerous. In truth, she had tuberculosis and needed care, but the asylum was cheaper. She died there alone. The institution recorded her death. Her family never visited. This pipeline was greased by convenience. At every step, the asylum was the easiest answer. It didn't require long-term planning. It didn't ask for proof. It accepted the children others couldn't or wouldn't handle, and so it grew. Once inside, the process was just as murky. Some children were admitted for observation and never re-evaluated. Others were committed indefinitely for minor behaviours. Thumb-sucking, bedwetting, tantrums. The line between mental illness and misbehaviour blurred. The further down the social ladder a child fell, the less likely anyone was to distinguish. In middle-class homes, a tantrum might earn a scolding. In a poor house, it might be the first step toward a padded room, and poverty played a larger role than any diagnosis. Pauper children were always the first to go. Families who had money could wait. They could try tutors, doctors, priests. They could afford to delay. But for the working class, every outburst was a cost. Every difficult child a threat to wages, to housing, to survival. Asylum commitment became a tool of economic triage. Some families visited their children in the institution. Some wrote letters, pleaded for updates, tried to bring them home. Others never came back, whether through shame, distance, or resignation. They left their sons and daughters to the system. Inside, the children joined a population of adults. They were not segregated by age. A 10-year-old boy might sleep next to a 50-year-old schizophrenic man. A girl of 8 might be placed in a ward for hysterical women. There were no child psychologists, no trauma-informed care, just routine, restraint, and silence. Over time, a few institutions attempted reform. Some created small schoolrooms, others experimented with training programs, basic crafts, sewing, gardening. But these were rare, and often short-lived. Budgets were cut, staff changed, and the children remained. At its height, the asylum system processed thousands of child intakes. Most were not reported in the newspapers. Most were not scandalous. They were quiet, bureaucratic, one more child in a world built for adults. And yet, each of those journeys, each pathway from home to ward, was a loss of freedom, of connection, of development. Because the pipeline that led children to the asylum was not one of care, it was one of removal. Society didn't know how to help them, so it hid them. Sometimes behind diagnoses, sometimes behind doors, always behind walls. And in doing so, it mistook invisibility for safety. The institutional pipeline was never a single road, but its destination was always the same. A bed in a locked ward, a name in a ledger, a future rewritten by paperwork. The system didn't need cruelty to work, it only needed silence. And silence Victorian Britain had in abundance. There's a strange kind of comfort in labels. They give us something to point to, something to say, this is what's wrong, now we know. But in the Victorian Asylum, labels were not tools of understanding. They were cages, and for children, they were especially unforgiving. By the time a child reached the gates of an asylum, they had usually passed through multiple systems: family, school, parish, or court. Each left its own mark, but the most lasting was the diagnosis, not because it was accurate, but because it was final. Victorian medicine was in its infancy, psychiatry even more so. Theories of the mind were tangled with moral judgment, religious belief and class bias. Terms like idiot, imbecile, and lunatic weren't just diagnostic, they were verdicts. And once written down, they were rarely removed. To modern eyes, the signs seem obvious. A child who flapped their hands, avoided eye contact, or repeated phrases might be understood today as autistic. A boy who heard voices or saw things others didn't might be diagnosed with schizophrenia. A girl with violent mood swings and self-harm might be treated for trauma or bipolar disorder. But in the 19th century, there were no such distinctions. There was only difference and punishment. Children who couldn't speak were called idiots. Children who lashed out were considered violent. Children who withdrew were accused of moral failing. Those with epilepsy, common among asylum children, were often seen as dangerous, even demonic. One 12-year-old boy was committed for melancholy and attempted suicide. He had tried to hang himself from a banister. The medical notes labelled him hopeless. No further treatment was attempted. A girl named Evelyn was admitted after throwing another child to the floor. She claimed a man named Jack the Ripper was after her. Instead of investigating her trauma or delusions, doctors noted her instability and confined her indefinitely. Some diagnoses came from behaviour that today would not even qualify as illness. A child refusing to eat, a boy who bit his nails until they bled, a girl who screamed at night, wet the bed, or refused to pray. These were not seen as symptoms of fear or disorder. They were seen as disobedience, and disobedience, in a moral society, required control. Many children faked symptoms to escape worse conditions. Schoolmasters, known for their cruelty, could drive children to feign madness just to leave the classroom. But once inside the asylum, the price was far higher than boredom. Once labelled insane, a child could not easily return. The diagnostic tools of the time were crude. Physicians relied on observation, hearsay, and deeply flawed ideas about heredity. If a parent had a history of madness, the child was assumed to be predisposed. If the child had a seizure, they might be institutionalized on the spot. There were no standardized tests, no neurological exams, no psychological interviews suited to children. Often a 5-minute conversation or less sealed their fate. Doctors described patients as dull, unteachable, restless or noisy. Some noted children stared blankly or spoke in a sing-song tone. These vague observations became evidence, and once recorded, they were rarely questioned. Girls in particular suffered from misdiagnosis tied to gender expectations. A girl who was assertive could be labelled hysterical. One who refused domestic chores might be seen as morally defective. Early sexual development or even curiosity could be grounds for confinement. One 11-year-old girl was institutionalized and punished with blistering for what staff described as sexual misbehavior. It was not medical care, it was moral discipline disguised in clinical robes. Some physicians genuinely believed they were helping. The theory of moral treatment, which guided many asylums, promoted order, routine, and labor as paths to stability. But without understanding the root causes of behavior, even the best intentions often became mechanical, even cruel. The misdiagnosis of trauma was common. Children who had been beaten, abandoned, or abused often presented with anxiety, aggression, or withdrawal. But instead of receiving care or counselling, they were pathologized. One girl arrived mute and expressionless after being assaulted. Her silence was taken as idiocy. She was committed, restrained, and left largely alone. No one asked what had happened before she stopped speaking. In some cases, children were not mentally ill at all. They were simply poor, illiterate, or too spirited for the structures around them. One inspector described a child admitted simply for being unmanageable. Another was labelled a lunatic for stealing food during a famine. And so the asylum became a net that caught not just the sick, but the misunderstood, the inconvenient, and the unloved. Some diagnoses were deliberately exaggerated. A family that could not afford private care for a dying child might claim they were dangerous or deranged in order to gain admission to the asylum's infirmary. One case involved a young girl with tuberculosis, falsely declared insane to secure institutional medical care. She died within weeks, far from her family, under a name she likely never heard spoken aloud. Overcrowded schools, overworked parishes, and overwhelmed parents all contributed to this diagnostic pipeline. When resources were limited, institutions absorbed what society rejected, and the labels helped justify it. An imbecile could not attend school. A lunatic could not testify in court. An idiot could not marry, vote, or own property. The label erased not just the child's present, but their future. Occasionally a child improved. Some grew calmer, spoke more, or learnt basic skills. In a few institutions such as Darenth or Earlswood, education and training were offered, but improvement did not guarantee release. A cured diagnosis rarely erased the institutional record. Many children remained confined simply because there was nowhere else for them to go. The asylum did not cure. It contained, and diagnoses, once written, hardened like stone. A few voices questioned this system. Some inspectors noted that many children appeared to be wrongly admitted. One report lamented that no special provision exists for children, and warned that their confinement with adult patients risked lifelong damage. But the system was too large, the demand too constant, the classifications too convenient. It is easy, with distance, to criticize these errors, to see the harm in the labels. But in the moment, surrounded by silence and social fear, it must have felt easier to believe the diagnosis than to challenge it. To say a child was broken made it easier to stop looking for what might help them heal. Misdiagnosis did not only trap children in institutions, it shaped how they were seen by doctors, staff, families, and themselves. It turned fear into definition, and difference into danger. For many, that transformation was irreversible. The next chapter will take us beyond the label, to the world children inhabited after they were confined. The wards, the routines, the things they saw and smelled and heard every day. Because once a diagnosis opened the door, what lay behind it was something far more enduring than a name on paper. It was a life rewritten, and for many, it was a sentence that never ended. It's easy to talk in numbers, to say how many children were admitted, how many died, how many beds were full. Numbers create distance, they help us cope. But inside each of those digits was a person, and inside some of those, a child. Let's leave behind the diagnoses for a moment. The tidy terms imbecile, idiot, lunatic that made it so easy to file someone away. Instead, let's look at the names, the fragments, the faces that still flicker in the margins of asylum records. Because once we say a name, the silence begins to crack. We begin with Frances A. She was 5 years old when she arrived. The notes say she was violent. They say she attacked other children and tore her own clothes. They say she was difficult, unpredictable, prone to screaming. But they also say this: she was small for her age, underweight. She rarely spoke, except to growl or mumble. She clawed at her skin until it bled. Staff kept her restrained. There are no letters from family, no mention of visitors. We don't know what she saw before the asylum, but we know what she saw inside: a long corridor, cold floors, and a locked door she couldn't reach. She died before her 7th birthday. The cause is listed as failure to thrive. Next, there's Ernest Thomas W. He was 12, tall for his age. The records say he tried to hang himself from a roof beam in the family home. His father found him just in time. Ernest was silent when questioned. He did not say why. The doctor described him as morose. The word melancholia appears 3 times in his file. He was admitted to the asylum the same week. There he refused food, refused to speak. One nurse wrote, "Looks at the floor, smiles when reprimanded." 6 months later, he stopped smiling. The final entry says, "Deemed incurable, no improvement observed." We do not know what became of Ernest. He disappears from the records. No discharge date. No death certificate. Only a gap. Now a girl named Evelyn Nen. Her file begins with the incident. She was accused of throwing another child to the floor. No serious injury. But during the inquiry, Evelyn said something strange. She claimed a man named Jack the Ripper was following her, that he whispered to her, that he lived in the walls. The staff assumed she was delusional. They noted her speech was disordered, that she was easily startled, that she laughed at inappropriate times. Today we might see signs of psychosis or trauma, but the staff saw only danger. Evelyn was confined to a quiet ward. She spent her days folding linen. She was 16. No one asked what had happened before. Another case. Edward M., 14 years old, committed for attacking his mother with a knife. The report says he believed she was possessed, that she was trying to poison him. Edward was described as excitable, impulsive, hostile, but he also reported hearing voices. He said they told him to run, to hide, to fight. He said they told him his mother was a demon. The medical officer dismissed the voices as imagination, called the boy hysterical. There was no treatment plan, only isolation. Edward spent most of his first year in the refractory ward. Later he was put to work in the gardens. He became quieter, but his delusions never faded. He remained in the institution for over 40 years. And then, an unnamed girl, admitted in 1872. The file is sparse. Her family declared her unmanageable. She was said to have wild eyes. She had tuberculosis. The family wanted her placed in a hospital, but there were no beds. The asylum was cheaper. They told the admitting physician she was dangerous, that she had tried to run into the street, that she broke windows, that she screamed at night. There's no evidence any of this was true. The physician signed the form. She was admitted that afternoon. She died within weeks. Malnourished. No family visits. No burial marker. Her death certificate lists the cause as phthisis, tuberculosis, but the real cause was abandonment. One father wrote desperate letters about his son. He is not mad, he insisted, only simple, only slow. He petitioned the asylum for months, offered to bring his son home, promised he could manage. The doctors denied his requests. They claimed the boy was congenitally deficient, a risk to himself and others. The father wrote again and again. Finally, on the 5th letter, they agreed to a supervised discharge. The boy returned home. There are no further records, no note of return. Sometimes silence means the worst, but sometimes it means peace. These are not isolated cases. They are fragments of a larger pattern. Children admitted for speaking oddly, for behaving strangely, for being poor or unloved or inconvenient. Their stories were rarely followed, their outcomes rarely recorded. For every Francis or Edward, there are dozens more whose names we'll never know. Children buried in ledgers, reduced to diagnoses, rewritten by institutional language, incurable, deficient, morally defective, words that made the child disappear. Even those who lived had their identities stripped. They became case numbers, their personalities reduced to notes, excitable, sluggish, noisy. We don't know what Francis loved, or whether Ernest ever laughed, or who Evelyn missed when the voices stopped. Their inner lives were never part of the file. This was the price of the system. To function, it had to flatten its inmates, to turn children into problems, to transform behavior into pathology, names into numbers. And yet, some traces survive. A school report tucked in the corner of a file, a drawing made in pencil on the back of a form, a single sentence from a staff member who said, "The girl smiled when she saw the garden." They remind us that these were not just patients, not just children lost to a flawed system. They were children, full stop, children with preferences, with fears, with strange imaginations and stubborn hearts. Some fought back, some went quiet, some waited for someone to come. Some of them maybe were saved, but most were forgotten. This is why the names matter, because a name refuses to disappear. It calls something back into focus. Not the whole story, not everything they felt, but enough to remember that they were here. As we move into the next chapter, into the daily life of the asylum, we carry these names with us, not as symbols, not as data, but as people who once sat in those rooms, who heard the bells, who woke to the sound of iron doors, whose lives did not end in their file, even if the file is all we have left. Sometimes history speaks in numbers, but sometimes it whispers in ink. In the margins of medical files, in the back of ward ledgers, in half-torn petitions and letters never answered, you can still hear them. Not loud, not proud, but there. The children of Victorian asylums didn't leave memoirs. They weren't given platforms. Their voices were filtered through attendants and inspectors, or buried under polite bureaucratic phrases. But every so often, the silence broke, and what broke through was pain, desperation, sometimes rage, sometimes nothing more than a line, but it's enough to echo. We begin with a child, unnamed, who scrawled on the back of an old form, "They said I bit, but I didn't. I only screamed." That sentence sat for decades, unnoticed, until an archivist transcribing old records found it, smudged with dust and time. It was likely never read by staff, but now it speaks. Another note, this one written by a nurse, possibly in frustration. The boy talks to walls and says his mother is in them. "I told him mothers can't live in bricks. He said they do, if you listen." No follow-up was noted. The boy remained on the ward for 5 more years. In another case, a teenage girl was accused of pretending to be mad. Her parents begged the doctors not to admit her. They said she was only difficult, that she hated school, that she liked to run away. The asylum took her anyway. Weeks later, she wrote a letter. "I don't know why I'm here. I want to learn a trade. I want to sew or clean. I'll be good if someone tells me how. I can't sleep because the woman next to me screams and the others think I'm deaf. But I'm not. I hear all of it, every night." The letter was never sent. It was found folded into the back of her file. A father once wrote, "My son is no more mad than your own. He is simple, yes. He is slow, but he knows my name and he cries when I leave. Do mad children cry the right tears at the right times?" He signed it 4 times, as if repetition would lend his words more power. The asylum responded formally. They said the child was improving under observation, that he needed stability, that discharge would be premature. The father wrote again, "He is not a parcel, he is not yours." Another parent, this time a mother, more blunt, "You can keep him. I am not able to feed him, and he makes the baby cry." No reply was sent. These are not grand statements, they're not political, they're not poetic, but they are voices that weren't meant to survive. They tell us things the reports don't. One staff note, scribbled in haste, "Boy attempted to run from dormitory, said he was chasing the wind." Another, "Child asks every day what day it is, refuses to believe it hasn't changed." Sometimes voices came from within official reports. A lunacy commission inspector visiting a mixed ward wrote, "It is a distressing scene to find children seated beside the howling mad. One girl clutched her knees and stared into nothing, while an old woman beside her recited psalms backwards." In another inspection, a commissioner noted, "The child ward, if it may be so called, lacks books, toys, or stimulation. The children are quiet, too quiet. It is a silence born not of calm, but of resignation." A visiting reverend recorded, "I asked the girl if she would like to pray. She said, 'Only if I can do it in my head.' I asked why. She said, 'Because the walls don't listen, but the air might.'" There are moments of unexpected clarity, even wit. A boy confined for disruptive behaviour once said to a doctor, "You keep saying I'm mad, but I sleep better than you do." Another, while being examined, asked, "Why does your face ask so many questions when your eyes already know?" One note, unsigned but believed to be from a staff member, reads, "Some of them are not sick, they are just small and frightened, and we keep them here because no one else will." It's rare to hear such honesty in the official archive, but scattered among the reports and diagnoses are these cracks in the system, moments when someone briefly saw the child inside the patient. One particularly heartbreaking case involves a girl who refused to speak for months. Doctors debated whether she was catatonic, whether she was faking, whether she was beyond recovery. One day, a nurse wrote, "She hummed a lullaby this morning. No words, just the tune. I didn't know it, but she smiled when I hummed back." There is no further mention of that exchange, but you can picture it. 2 humans, one humming, one listening. For a moment, the asylum faded. Even the angry voices tell us something vital. Children who shouted that they didn't belong there, who screamed names no one else remembered, who scratched on walls, on beds, on their own skin, just to prove they existed. One scratched message was found behind a coat hook in an old ward. "I am not what they say I am. I am me. I am still me." That phrase, "still me," carries something defiant, something resistant, a voice refusing to dissolve. Many of the quotes we have were recorded second-hand, written down by staff, often with skepticism or scorn. But even in that form they reveal more than perhaps the recorder intended. They show us that the children spoke, even when ignored, even when mislabeled, even when no one answered back. They asked questions, they told stories, they whispered secrets, they cried, and through those cracks we glimpsed their humanity. Not abstract, not theoretical. Immediate, real. As we prepare to explore the daily life inside the asylum, what the children saw, heard, touched, endured, these voices remind us what was always at stake. These were not silent souls. They were not passive cases. They were trying to speak. And now, at last, we're listening. If you stood in the hallway of a Victorian asylum in the late 19th century, just for a moment, you might have mistaken it for a place of order. Tiled floors, stone walls, corridors polished by the drag of 100 feet, windows high, narrow, caged in iron. The scent of carbolic acid heavy in the air, silence broken only by distant murmurs, the creak of a trolley or a cough echoing through brick. To the visiting inspector, it might have looked clean, controlled, even peaceful, but to live there, especially as a child, was something else entirely. For the youngest inmates, daily life began and ended under lock and key. The day started early, often before first light. A bell would ring, hard footsteps would follow. Nurses or attendants, overworked, undertrained, would enter the dormitories and issue orders. Get up, wash, dress, stand straight. The water was cold, always. There was no allowance for weather, age or fear. Children were expected to scrub their faces and hands quickly, efficiently. There was no privacy, no quiet reassurance, just a line of bodies performing a routine. Beds were iron-framed, lined in rows, each with a single thin mattress, stuffed with straw or old cotton, and a rough wool blanket. No personal items, no stuffed animals, no keepsakes. Everything was institutional, down to the pillow. In winter, breath fogged in the dormitories. Windows rattled in their panes. Some buildings had no central heating. Fires, if provided, were distant, kept behind grates, inaccessible. Children often shivered themselves awake. Breakfast was a brief affair. Gruel or bread, sometimes tea, often watered down. The food wasn't poisoned or cruel. It was just indifferent, meant to sustain, not nourish. And then came the day's tasks. Older children might be sent to help in the laundry, the kitchens, or the grounds. Boys often dug trenches, pushed carts, or cleared brush. Girls folded linen, scrubbed floors, or stitched torn uniforms. There was little distinction between labour and treatment. You were well if you worked. If you didn't, you were watched. Those deemed too unstable to work remained on the wards. These children paced, rocked, or sat for hours, silent. Some muttered to themselves. Others stared at cracks in the wall. Some sat curled in corners, ignored unless they became disruptive. There was no regular schooling. Some institutions experimented with lessons, letters, numbers, prayers, but they were sporadic and rarely adapted to the needs of the children. Most were assumed incapable of learning. Many were never tested. When inspectors asked why children were not being taught, one superintendent reportedly replied, "They do not read because they cannot learn." That was the consensus, that some minds were unreachable, unworthy of effort. The wards themselves were often overcrowded. Rooms meant for 10 might hold 20. There were too few staff. Cleanliness varied. The scent of urine lingered in some corners. Bedpans overflowed. Towels were shared. Boys and girls were usually separated, but not always by age. A child of 7 might sleep among teenagers, or beside an elderly patient. The unpredictability of placement meant that some children lived with adults who screamed through the night, who hallucinated, who struck out in confusion. There were no earplugs, no soft light, no story before bed, only sleep, if it came. Nighttime in the asylum was a world of its own, doors locked, lights dimmed. Some children cried, others whispered prayers, a few chanted, or rocked, or struck their heads against the wall. The staff often rotated between day and night shifts. Some were kind, some were cruel, some simply endured. One child described in a later memoir recalled, "The nights were worse than the days. I could hear breathing everywhere, but never my own." There were activities on occasion, walks in the yard, hymns in the chapel. Some asylums had small gardens, others offered games, checkers, dominoes, though rarely tailored to young children. But for the most part, the routine never changed. Wake, wash, eat, sit, work, eat, sit, sleep, and repeat. Medical care was minimal. Doctors visited in rounds. There were no paediatricians, no child psychiatrists. Medications, if given, were broad-spectrum sedatives, chloral hydrate, bromide, laudanum. Some children were bled, purged, or placed on restricted diets. For behavioural issues, the response was restraint, straps, isolation, cold baths, not as punishment officially, but as management. Records describe one child being placed in seclusion for continuous vocalizations. She was 7. Even in the best-run asylums, emotional warmth was rare. Touch was clinical. Reassurance was procedural. Love, if it existed, came from one-off relationships, a kind nurse, an older patient, but the system itself was built on distance. To love a child too closely was to be broken by their suffering. Most staff learned not to look too long, not to ask too much. Some children formed bonds with each other. They shared food, braided hair, held hands under covers. Others became bullies, mimicking the authority around them. Survival required adaptation, and for those who couldn't adapt, who cried too often, or resisted, or simply stopped responding, the days became a blur. No child grew in the asylum. They aged. They became institutionalized. They learned when to speak, when to be silent, how to disappear, and when they didn't, they were noticed. And being noticed often meant punishment. One report details a boy, age 9, punished for hiding under a table during rounds. He was placed in isolation, no light, no blanket. The note says, he was quiet afterward. Quiet was the goal. Stillness was virtue. Emotion was disorder. No one painted their rooms. No one told them bedtime stories. No one taught them lullabies. What they learned came from what they saw, what they feared, what they endured. The living conditions of Victorian asylums weren't always cruel in design. Many believed they were doing good. That order was kindness. That stability was care. But for a child, it was not enough. Not when every sound echoed. Not when every face was a stranger. Not when the world beyond the gates was no longer a memory, but a dream they stopped having. In the next section, we will step closer into this world. Not just where the children lived, but how. What their days felt like. What the textures were. The smells. The sounds. The details that rarely made it into the reports, but filled every hour of every day. Because to understand what was taken from them, we must first understand what they were given. And what they were given was survival, and little else. After the beds were made and the floors scrubbed, after the bell had rung and the morning line had shuffled through its silent march to washrooms and breakfast benches, the children of the Victorian Asylum entered the longest part of the day. The hours between breakfast and evening bell were not filled with learning or games or imagination. They were filled with tasks, simple, repetitive, often menial, always monitored. This was not school, it was structure, and for many, it was the only form of treatment they would ever receive. Work, they believed, kept madness at bay, and so children laboured. There was no Child Labour Act to protect them here, no age restrictions, no rest breaks. If your hands could grip a mop, a rake, a spindle, then you were put to use. It didn't matter how old you were, only how manageable. For the boys, there were outdoor chores, digging in the garden, hauling coal, pushing wheelbarrows full of kitchen waste, tending the pigs, gathering firewood. In some asylums, they were trained in rudimentary carpentry or shoemaking, though rarely with any intent to release them into the world. It was not education, it was occupation. For the girls, the labour was inside. Laundries thick with steam and soap, kitchens full of slop buckets and copper pans, endless sewing and mending and folding, some scrubbed floors with stiff brushes, others polished brass or tended to infirm patients far older than they were. From the outside, this routine looked like rehabilitation. Order, activity, something to fill the day. But for the children within it, it was monotony disguised as medicine. A bell rang to start each work session. Another bell ended it. The intervals between were largely silent. Talking was discouraged. Singing forbidden. Children moved in lines, heads down, bodies stiff. A wrong word, a misplaced tool, a refusal to comply, and the punishment could range from isolation to the loss of a rare privilege, like an extra slice of bread or a walk outside. In some institutions, the routine never changed, not for weeks, months, even years. One boy reportedly folded the same type of laundry, in the same corner, for over 800 days. He had arrived at age 11. He was 16 when he stopped. No one recorded why. In certain asylums like Darenth and Earlswood, more formal work programs were introduced. These were closer to occupational therapy, organised workshops, limited instruction. But they were the exception, not the rule. In most places, labour was neither educational nor voluntary. It was expected. For some, the work became a form of rhythm, a way to make the hours pass without the chaos of thoughts. But for others, especially the youngest, it blurred the boundary between confinement and exploitation. One report described a girl, aged 9, tasked with carrying linen bundles across 3 wards. Her arms shook. She dropped them once. She was struck lightly on the back of the head and told to do it again. Another file noted a boy responsible for sweeping a long corridor 4 times daily. When he stopped to tie his shoe, a nurse told him to sweep and fall if you must. These weren't punishments per se, just instructions in a place where compliance was the only virtue. Some of the children had physical disabilities, clubbed feet, seizures, weak eyesight. That rarely changed the work assignment. Unless you were completely bedridden, you were expected to contribute, and if you didn't, you were labelled lazy, resistant, incapable. These weren't just observations, they were medical judgments. They shaped your file and your future. Occasionally there were small mercies, a kind nurse who let a girl sit by the window while darning socks, a boy allowed to care for a bird that nested outside the kitchen. But these were deviations, not policy. The routine was built to be total. You woke at the same hour, washed at the same basin, ate the same meal at the same seat, walked the same halls, heard the same bells, folded the same sheets, repeated the same lines. Even holidays, when observed, were tightly structured. Christmas brought slightly better food, a hymn in the chapel, and perhaps a paper crown. But the labour resumed the next day. New Year's brought no promises, just another page in a logbook. The older children were sometimes assigned supervisory roles. They were made to watch the younger ones, report misbehaviour, enforce small rules. It gave the illusion of hierarchy, of purpose. But in practice, it often created tension. Fights broke out. Power was misused, and rarely punished. Some children coped by embracing the rhythm. They became proud of their tasks, took ownership, memorized procedures, found identity in small, assigned duties. Others resisted. Some broke tools, hid laundry, refused to move, and resistance in this world was not seen as agency, it was pathology. A child who wouldn't work was considered sick, defiant, dangerous. In one recorded case, a girl who refused to sew was restrained for the rest of the afternoon. The note read, "Moral refusal to engage, treated accordingly." Another boy who hid in the supply closet during scrubbing duty was sent to isolation for willful sloth. What we see, reading between the lines, is how labour became a diagnostic tool. Work meant you were improving, refusal meant you were failing, and so the children worked, because to work was to be seen as salvageable, or at least not a problem. It didn't matter if the work was joyful, it didn't matter if it suited their mind, their body, or their age. What mattered was that it kept them occupied. The Victorian mind feared idleness, and feared the idle poor most of all. In the asylum, this fear was institutionalized. Children were not trained for futures beyond the walls. They were managed into silence within them. And yet, small things leaked through. A drawing left in a dustbin, a carved pattern in the wood of a workbench, a scrap of coloured thread tied in a girl's braid. Small rebellions, fleeting expressions, proof that even within routine the child remained. Not always visible, not always heard, but present. As we step next into the sensory world of the asylum, its smells, its sounds, its textures, remember this, that behind every repeated task, behind every bell and folded sheet, was a child trying to make sense of a world built for control, not understanding why, only learning that if they kept their head down, they might make it through the day. It's one thing to read about the conditions of Victorian asylums. It's another to imagine living inside one, not from above through reports and registers, but from inside the body. What did it feel like to wake up there? What did a child hear, smell, touch, see, over and over, until those sensations were no longer noticed, but absorbed? The Victorian asylum was a world of forced rhythm, but beneath that rhythm was a raw sensory landscape. And for children, that landscape was everything. Let's begin with sound. From the moment a child opened their eyes, sound dictated the day. Bells, always bells. Bells for rising, for washing, for eating, for lining up, for working, for moving, for stopping. Each bell was sharp, metallic, echoing down stone corridors like a command. There was no warm wake-up, no gentle voices, just the clatter of keys and the call of orders. Children learnt to flinch at footsteps, to anticipate the tone of approaching staff. A hurried stride might mean punishment, a slow one, perhaps inspection. And layered beneath the official noises were the human ones, the sobs, the muttering, the screams. Asylums did not separate children from adult patients in any meaningful way. Wards were filled with people in distress. Some shouted scripture, others laughed to themselves, some wailed without end. Children absorbed it all. One report described a ward where a woman screamed for 2 hours each night. No one intervened. A child in the same room began covering her ears with her blanket. She did it every night for a year. Imagine the sound of metal bed frames scraping concrete, cutlery clinking in forced silence, doors slamming, the soft sob of someone praying under breath. Now, smell. The air in many asylums was thick with carbolic acid, the disinfectant of choice. It clung to clothing, bedsheets, even skin. Staff considered it the scent of cleanliness, but for children, it was the scent of institution. Mixed with it were other smells: unwashed bodies, rotting vegetables from the kitchen, mildew from damp walls, urine from unclean corners. Laundry was cleaned irregularly. Personal hygiene depended on staff supervision. Some children soiled themselves and were left unchanged for hours. The smell of the asylum was not one thing. It was a layering of neglect, masked by chemistry. Now, sight. Lighting was minimal. Natural light filtered through high, narrow windows, often barred or frosted. Artificial light came from gas lamps or oil, flickering, dim. Walls were bare, grey, institutional green. Decorations were rare. Some wards had religious plaques. Others had faded posters instructing obedience. Nothing was soft. Children saw the same things every day, the same grey walls, the same uniforms, the same expressions on tired staff faces. They saw others in distress, patients rocking, pacing, restrained. They saw punishment, children taken away, beds stripped, bowls removed. One child later recalled the terror of seeing another boy strapped down. He said, "I didn't know what he had done, but I knew I could too." And then, touch. The texture of asylum life was coarse. Mattresses were thin, blankets itchy, clothes stiff. Shoes, when provided, often ill-fitting. Children were touched in ways that were clinical, functional, or corrective, but rarely comforting. Nurses brushed hair, pulled arms, buttoned uniforms, but few embraced, few soothed. Many children flinched from touch. Others clung to it, even when rough. Beds were narrow, hard, baths cold. Wooden benches offered no softness. Doors had iron latches, keys jangled on belts. And then, the absence of touch, more profound still. The child who cried and was not held. The child who fell and was told to stand. The child who reached for a hand and found none. All of this built a physical vocabulary of neglect, one that the body remembered, long after the words faded. Even taste had its place. The food in asylums was consistent, bland, starchy, sometimes spoiled, porridge in the morning, bread and weak tea at midday, stew or boiled vegetables at night, no seasoning, rarely meat, no sweets. Some children lost their appetite, others hoarded food under pillows, a few were force-fed. Eating was done in silence, a room of clinking spoons and slurping mouths. One inspector noted that a child stared at his bowl for 10 minutes before touching it. No one asked why. The asylum was not torturous by design, but its sensory world was one of deprivation, of repetition, of overstimulation in some places, and deadening quiet in others. It created children who startled easily, who slept lightly, who developed tics, who stopped speaking. The environment itself became part of the diagnosis. Children who rocked, perhaps once a soothing motion, were now labelled disturbed. Children who hummed, maybe to block out screams, were marked as disordered. The system mistook coping for illness. It pathologized survival. In some institutions, attempts were made to improve the environment. A mural painted, a toy box introduced, a window seat allowed. But these were exceptions. The dominant sensory memory of the asylum was one of lack, a lack of warmth, a lack of variation, a lack of tenderness. And within that sensory vacuum, children shaped their own responses. Some retreated inward, some became hyper-attuned to sound, some fixated on small details, a knot in the wood, a crack in the tile, as anchors. These habits were sometimes punished, sometimes ignored, rarely understood. What happens when a child grows up in a world where every sensation teaches submission, where the sound of a bell carries more weight than the sound of their name, where the smell of acid means order, and the feel of wool means safety, and the absence of sound means danger? What kind of memories are formed? What kind of body emerges? As we move toward the next chapter, treatment and discipline, remember this: that discipline didn't always come in the form of punishment. It was also built into the fabric of the place, into every surface, every scent, every sound. The asylum didn't just restrain the children, it surrounded them, until even the air they breathed belonged to someone else. If you were a child in a Victorian asylum, and the staff said you were sick, not sick like fever or a broken arm, but sick in the mind, what would that mean for your body? It's a question that defies our modern instincts. We want to imagine therapy, gentle words, patient care. But the reality for most children in institutions during the 19th century was much colder. Medical practice in asylums was not a science of healing. It was a system of management, And for children, it meant being subjected to treatments not for their benefit, but for the convenience of the institution. Let's begin with the philosophy. In the early decades, mental illness was seen as a disturbance of the bodily humours. Madness might be caused by too much blood, or bile, or an unbalanced temperament. This theory justified purging, blistering, bleeding, and emetic treatments, methods already falling out of favour in general medicine, but still alive in asylums. Children were not exempt. In fact, they were often more vulnerable to these treatments, because they couldn't protest in the ways adults could. A boy who cried too much might be given a purge. A girl who rocked in her sleep might be bled to relieve cerebral congestion. Opium was used liberally, chloral hydrate, bromides, later phenobarbital. These sedatives didn't heal anything, but they calmed, they quieted, they made the ward easier to manage. If a child slept through the day, they weren't screaming, they weren't biting, they weren't asking to go home. Records describe children dosed daily, sometimes for years. The long-term effects, stunted growth, neurological dullness, dependency, were not studied, they were simply endured. And then there was restraint. Though the official policy in many asylums, especially after the mid-1800s, discouraged mechanical restraint, it remained a constant reality. Straps, muffs, straitjackets, padded cells. Children who bit, who struck out, who cried inconsolably, these children were often restrained, for their safety it was said, or for others. But safety in practice often meant silence, stillness. One file notes a 7-year-old placed in a restraint chair for excessive whimpering. Another child, age 9, was tied at the wrists for repeatedly tapping her fingers against a wall. The staff described her as agitating the ward. For those considered beyond restraint, isolation followed. The padded cell, a bare chamber with a mattress and nothing else. Lights out, doors locked, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. Alone. There was also cold water therapy. The principle was simple: shock the body to settle the mind. Children were submerged in cold baths, sometimes held under for extended moments, not as punishment officially, but as a treatment. To calm nerves, to break cycles, to refresh. One girl was given 6 cold immersions in 10 days. Another, a boy with seizures, was bathed in freezing water after each episode to diminish recurrence. It is hard now to read these accounts and not recoil. But for the doctors, many of whom had little paediatric training and believed mental illness was something to be tamed like a wild dog, these methods were logic. The asylum was a system, the treatments were the gears, and the children were placed inside, not as individuals to be healed, but as cases to be processed. There were gentler efforts too. Some institutions explored moral treatment, structured walks, gardening, music. These were not available to all and rarely prioritized for the most disturbed children, but when offered, they showed promise. Some children reportedly calmed when allowed time outdoors, when taught simple crafts, or when paired with a compassionate caretaker. Yet these were the exceptions. Most days, a child who showed distress received little more than a sedative and a stern report. Medical notes were brief, often a sentence. No change. Still agitated. Administered bromide. Rarely did they ask why. Why was the child crying? Why had they stopped speaking? Why did they scream only at night? Some physicians tried. One noted, with uncharacteristic softness, "The boy stares not at us, but through us. He fears something I do not know." Another wrote, "She holds her breath until she faints, not to frighten us, but to escape." But such insights did not become practice. They remained lines in a file. Staff were under pressure. Budgets were tight. Expectations were low. There was no department of child psychiatry, no long-term care plans. Once labelled, a child might remain in the same ward, on the same medication for years. There was one recorded case of a girl given belladonna for nervous excitement. The dose caused hallucinations. The next day she screamed through the morning and had to be restrained. The notes do not mention whether the treatment continued. In another case, a boy received daily doses of chloral hydrate for 2 years. He was eventually noted as lethargic but compliant. The doctors marked it a success. Sometimes treatments were given based on gender. Girls who displayed sexual curiosity were deemed morally defective. One was subjected to blistering, a painful application of chemicals to the skin, as punishment disguised as therapy. Boys who disobeyed were considered degenerate. Their treatment was more often physical: restraint, confinement, labour. The medical practices reinforced the social norms of the era: obedience, silence, discipline. Children who complied were called improved. Children who resisted were pathologized. One boy, age 10, reportedly said, "If I sleep when they say, and eat when they say, and don't ask questions, they don't look at me. That is better." That, in essence, was the goal. Not wellness, not recovery, but manageability. And within this framework, true care was almost impossible. For many children, medical treatment blurred into daily routine. Sedation became bedtime, restraint became timeout, baths became punishment. There were few clean lines, and for the children, no clarity at all. Why was this happening? Why did they feel this way? Why did no one explain? Some stopped asking, some became what the system expected, others never did. As we prepare to enter the next chapter, the systems of punishment that followed when treatment failed, we should hold on to this truth that many of these children were not treated at all. They were calmed, managed, controlled. But healing? Healing was a word no one taught them. There is a difference between treatment and punishment, but in Victorian asylums, especially for children, that line often dissolved. Discipline was not just a response to misbehaviour. It was a philosophy, a structure built into the floors and corridors, a daily lesson whispered between locked doors. If the medicine didn't calm you, the rules would break you. Punishment in the asylum was not always dramatic. There were few formal beatings. Corporal punishment, while not banned, was not always recorded. But what did exist, quietly, persistently, was a system of deprivation, shaming, and coercion. Let's begin with isolation. The padded cell, the refractory ward, the linen room. Children were separated for screaming, for crying, for refusing to comply with an order. Some were isolated for wetting the bed, others for breaking a toy, shouting a name, or asking to go home. One record described a child left in seclusion for persistent refusal to smile. Another, boy removed from ward for disobedience, refused to make eye contact during meal. These were not rare entries, they were ordinary, expected. Isolation rooms were bare. A mattress, a chamber pot, no books, no light after dark. The walls muffled sound, but not emotion. Some children screamed until their voices cracked. Others lay silent, eyes open, tracing cracks in the ceiling. Staff often claimed these rooms were not punishment, but protection, a chance for the child to reflect. But children do not reflect in silence. They retreat, they fracture. Then there was restraint, though sometimes categorized under medical management. Restraint also functioned as punishment. A child who hit another might be strapped down. A child who refused food might have their arms bound. Straitjackets were used, muffs, chairs with belts. In some cases, children were restrained in full view of the ward, a silent example for others. One inspector noted a boy tied to a bench for 3 hours for general defiance. A nurse wrote of a girl who screamed during prayers. She was placed in a muff and led to chapel anyway. Restraint was about control, but it was also about message. To misbehave was to lose your body. There were more subtle punishments too. Food withheld, portions cut. A child who misbehaved might receive cold porridge instead of warm, might eat alone, might be watched while eating. Some were denied time in the yard, denied access to the rare treat, an apple, a sweet, a walk. One child had a single doll. When she was found weeping after lights out, the doll was taken. The note read, "Must learn to self-soothe." Sometimes punishment came from peers. Older children given minor authority over the younger, told to supervise chores, to report misbehaviour. This hierarchy bred cruelty. A child mocked, shamed, excluded. Staff turned away, laughed, called it discipline. There were also the punishments never named, the prolonged silences, the refusal to speak to a child, the coldness of a caregiver's gaze. These weren't in the ledgers, but they lived in memory. One former inmate, writing decades later, recalled, "The worst thing was when they ignored me, when I cried and no one even looked, when I screamed and they left the room. That's when I knew I didn't exist." Children learn the rules quickly. Don't speak unless spoken to, don't touch what isn't yours, don't cry too loud, don't ask questions, don't ask to go home. They learned that punishment wasn't always violent, but it was always waiting. Some children adapted by mimicking the system. They became the quiet ones, the good patients. They folded their clothes, sat up straight, memorized prayers. Some did this for survival. Some, because they no longer knew who they were without the rules. Others resisted. They broke things, hid under beds, refused to eat. And the system responded. One boy, age 8, refused to clean his shoes. He was denied breakfast. A girl who tore pages from a prayer book had her hands strapped for 3 days. One child, described as sullen, was placed on silence duty. No one allowed to speak to him. He, in turn, was forbidden to speak. For a week, not every punishment was written down. Some were improvised. Some lived only in memory. A look, a grip too tight, a door slammed just slowly enough to frighten. Some staff believed they were teaching discipline, that strictness would save the child. They came from a culture where obedience was morality, where a child's will was something to be bent. But others knew. One nurse wrote quietly in the margin of a chart, "Too much punishment today, they are more afraid than helped." Even she had no power to stop it. Punishment was the logic of the place. It was its own language. A child might not understand why they were confined, why they were here, but they learnt quickly what the system wanted. Compliance, stillness, silence. Anything less was answered with correction, and so many children learned to disappear, to avoid the strap, the cold meal, the night in the dark room, to survive. The next chapter in this story will step outside this cycle of pain into the rare moments of relief, of kindness, of small mercies, because even in a place built to contain, there were still sparks that slipped through the cracks, and even where punishment reigned, not every soul forgot how to be gentle. Every building has its shadows. In Victorian asylums they often walked on two legs, wore uniforms, and held keys. Not every attendant was cruel, not every nurse neglectful. There were acts of kindness here, small ones, muffled by policy, buried under routine, but the system that raised those walls, that managed the wards, that filled the dormitories with children, did not make it easy to be kind. To understand how abuse became possible, even predictable, we must begin with the staff. Most attendants and nurses in Victorian asylums had no formal medical training. Many were working-class men and women, former labourers, soldiers, seamstresses, recruited through parish boards or personal connection. Their preparation for handling mental illness, especially in children, was minimal. The job was exhausting. Shifts were long. Wages were low. Supervision was inconsistent. One report noted a ratio of 1 nurse to 45 patients on a children's ward. In such conditions, even the most well-meaning staff could become indifferent, detached, mechanised. And then there were those who came with less intention. Staffing shortages meant that character checks were rare. Dismissals for misconduct were often quiet, internal, and temporary. One attendant removed from his post for striking a child was rehired 2 counties over within the year. There were no cameras, no child advocacy units. If a child said they were hit, the word of an adult, especially a male staff member, carried far more weight. One young boy was found with bruises on his wrists and jaw. The report noted he had been handled firmly during a behavioural episode. No further inquiry was made. Another girl, age 11, accused an attendant of pushing her against a wall. She was declared hysterical. The man continued his shift. Not every case was documented, not every act violent, but the structure allowed it. Children were not seen as reliable witnesses. Their cries were interpreted as symptoms, their injuries, if minor, as accidents. There was also emotional abuse. Staff sometimes mocked patients, called them names, used their diagnoses as insults. One child was called Beast so frequently by a nurse that she began using it to refer to herself in the third person. Humiliation was common. Wet beds were paraded. Mistakes were announced. Children who rocked or flapped their hands were imitated for amusement. And neglect. Neglect was its own kind of violence. A child left wet for hours. A child whose toothache went untreated for weeks. A child who cried for their mother and was told she had forgotten them. These were not crimes of passion. They were habits, cultural permissions, things tolerated, then expected. One inspector wrote, "The boys are quiet because they have learned that noise invites pain." Sometimes abuse came in the name of discipline. A boy strapped for speaking out of turn. A girl isolated for crying. A child made to kneel in a corner until they fainted. Sometimes it came as treatment. A sedative administered not to soothe but to silence. A bath not to clean but to shock. Sometimes it was casual. An attendant yanking a child by the arm. A nurse feeding too fast, spilling hot broth on a child's lap. These incidents rarely made the reports, and then there were the darkest cases. Sexual abuse was the shadow most feared and least documented. There are fragments, whispered accusations, marginal notes, a girl who flinched when approached by male staff, a boy found in the company of an attendant at night, behaviour unexplained, but little was pursued. When questions were raised, they were often buried, staff transferred, families not notified, children disbelieved. In rare cases, investigations were launched. One superintendent was dismissed after multiple allegations from patients, but his file remained clean enough to secure a post elsewhere. One young girl, pregnant at 14, was sent to another institution without her case being reviewed. The attending physician wrote only, "Patient transferred due to condition." The absence of records does not mean the absence of abuse. It means the system was designed not to see it, and for the child, there was no refuge. To complain was to be punished. To resist was to be sedated. To speak was to be labelled. Incoherent, uncooperative, prone to fabrication. The staff held the keys to the rooms, to the rations, to the files. To believe a child meant challenging the very structure that gave the adult power. Still, some did try. A few nurses wrote letters to inspectors, complained quietly to chaplains. Some were dismissed for instability or inappropriate softness. One nurse noted, "The child winced when touched, not from pain, but from memory." Another wrote, "If kindness is discouraged, then we are breeding ghosts." But those voices were not enough. The culture of silence, of distance, of order above empathy prevailed. The children bore the cost. Many forgot how to trust, flinched at touch, feared raised voices. Some grew into adults who never entered another building without counting exits. The staffing crisis was never solved, the undertraining never addressed. The assumption that children could endure what adults barely survived remained intact. And so abuse, emotional, physical, psychological, continued not as anomaly, but as background. The next chapter will look at what slipped through that background. Not the suffering, but the resistance, the defiance, the quiet moments where children remembered they were still themselves. Before we go there, let this settle, that what happened to them was not just a failure of care. It was the design, and for many it was the only adult touch they knew. Outside the asylum walls, the world turned slowly. Horses clattered down cobbled streets. Chimneys smoked. Children played marbles on steps, while adults hung washing, minding coins and neighbours and reputation. Victorian Britain was a world obsessed with appearances, and the asylum, especially the idea of children inside it, was something no one wanted to look at directly. Society didn't talk about asylum children, not because it didn't know, but because it knew just enough to turn away. The average citizen might pass the asylum gates once a year, on church outings, on charity days. Perhaps they heard stories in the paper, escaped lunatics, shocking murders, the occasional moral panic. But the names of real children, the texture of real lives behind the stone, those were invisible. For most it was easier that way. Madness had always been wrapped in fear, but madness in children, that was something worse. It challenged the fantasy of innocence, of purity, of controllable futures, and so the language adapted. Society called them idiots, imbeciles, moral defectives, words that sounded scientific but functioned like cages, words that let you put distance between yourself and a child who twitched, or screamed, or refused to speak. The medical profession reinforced this divide. Doctors wrote articles, professors gave lectures. They described the mentally defective child as a burden, a drain, a future criminal, if left unchecked. Some eugenicists went further. They argued these children should not be seen in public, that they should not reproduce. That institutionalization was not just care, it was protection for society. In newspapers, asylum children appeared only when sensational. A girl with a deformity mistaken for possession. A boy who escaped and caused panic. An institution under fire for overcrowding. But never the quiet child rocking in a corner. Never the girl who sang to herself when she thought no one was listening. To most, asylums were necessary. Unpleasant, yes, but practical. And if children were there, well, someone must have decided they belonged. Poor families often believed it too. They were told the child could not be educated, that he would disrupt the classroom, that she would never marry, that this was the only place left. And what did they know to argue back with? They had no experts, no diagnoses, only tired hands and empty cupboards. Even when parents grieved, they were often told to be grateful. You're lucky there's a place for her. He'll be safer there. This is kindness, really. It became easier to believe it, to tell themselves the child was being fed, watched, managed, to believe the building cared because no one else could. Among the middle class, mental illness was shame. A son sent quietly away, a daughter whose name was never spoken again. Private asylums handled these cases, discreet and expensive. But when funds ran out, or behaviour escalated, the public system absorbed them too. Even reformers struggled to speak about the children. Campaigns for better conditions often centred on adult cases, mad women abused, men in chains. The image of childhood within those walls disrupted the narrative. It was too much, too disturbing, too dangerous to the social order. Because if you admitted children were suffering there, you had to admit they shouldn't be there at all. A few voices tried. Journalists wrote exposés, clergy made visits. Some politicians toured facilities and came away changed. But systemic reform came slowly. Resistance was strong. Funding was low. Public interest flickered and faded. The asylum was a black box, a solution no one wanted to examine too closely. And so myths grew. That children in asylums were too far gone, that they didn't know or feel, that they were happy there. One inspector wrote, "The public imagines them playing in fields, singing hymns, holding hands in sunlight." He added, "They do not hear the crying." For the children, the greatest isolation wasn't the walls. It was this social invisibility, knowing that the world outside didn't wonder where they were, didn't write, didn't visit, didn't care. One child said to a nurse, "Do people outside remember us? Or only when we're dead?" That question hung over every corridor, and yet society depended on the asylum, not just for care, but for order, for reassurance, for the idea that all problems had a place to go. A child too wild for the classroom? The asylum. Too poor for special care? The asylum. Too angry, too quiet, too different? The asylum. It was not a system born of malice. It was born of discomfort, of the need to believe that every person who vanished into those doors was meant to be there, that it was better this way. Even as the years passed and reports mounted and deaths were recorded, the myth endured, because to see the truth meant seeing yourself in the child, and most couldn't do that. The next chapter will be different, because within the silence, some children pushed back, they wrote, they shouted, they escaped, they survived, but for now understand this, that the world outside the asylum did not rescue them, it explained them away. In a world ruled by silence, the press was the one voice loud enough to reach inside the asylum, but it rarely did. Victorian newspapers reported on war, on empire, on industry and scandal. They told stories of thieves and monarchs, heroes and murders. They filled their pages with serialized fiction, gossip, reform, and the occasional horror. But the daily lives of children in lunatic asylums remained mostly unwritten. When they appeared, it was not in sympathy, it was in spectacle. A boy who escaped and frightened a town, a girl found wandering barefoot and confused, a court case involving a child declared dangerous. These were the moments the press cared about, not the ordinary child confined for years, not the quiet suffering, not the misdiagnosis, the punishment, the death that came without notice. In the mid-1800s, public concern about asylum conditions did begin to grow. Journalists and reformers called attention to overcrowding, underfunding, and inhumane treatment. But even then, the spotlight fell on adult institutions, on famous scandals, on dramatic cruelty. Children were footnotes. When child cases were mentioned, they were framed as anomalies, tragedies perhaps, but not indictments. The tone was clinical, often moralizing. Feeble-minded girl causes incident. Idiot boy removed from school. Violent lunatic child confined. These weren't names, they were warnings. Some publications dabbled in reform. Medical journals discussed the classification of juvenile mental illness. Parliamentary reports were summarized. Occasionally, a journalist would visit an institution and write of sorrowful scenes and hopeless cases. But even then, the writing served to distance, not connect. The children were rarely quoted. Their thoughts never explored, their individuality erased by labels. In one article from 1893, a journalist wrote, "The children seemed content. They smiled when approached. They are well fed, if not well developed." He did not ask why they smiled. He did not wonder what contentment might mean for a child who had never known anything else. The press often accepted the language of the institutions. Care, protection, training. They repeated these terms uncritically, reinforcing the idea that asylums were places of benevolence, that the children within were being saved from themselves, from their families, from a society that had no place for them. And when abuse surfaced, the coverage followed familiar patterns. A rogue attendant, a negligent superintendent, a shocking event. The story would flare, names would be named, an inquiry might follow, and then silence. The institution would remain, the system unchanged. When children died, the reports were brief. Inmate expired during the night. Young patient succumbed to illness. Death of lunatic boy noted. No cause explored. No life reviewed. No questions asked. One exception came in 1901, when a series of deaths at a northern asylum sparked national attention. The press briefly turned its eye to the treatment of defective children. Headlines demanded answers. Politicians promised reform. Editorials spoke of moral duty. But weeks later, a new scandal emerged. a different distraction, and the children faded again. In fiction, they were monsters or martyrs. The mad child trope appeared in serialized novels: the possessed girl, the dangerous orphan, the boy who saw ghosts. Rarely were these characters shown as real children. They were metaphors, warnings, plot devices, and so, even in imagination, asylum children were denied their own voice. Only in some philanthropic publications, pamphlets, fundraising appeals did their humanity emerge. Photos of grim-faced boys in uniforms, stories of mild improvement, appeals for new buildings, for more beds, for donations. But even here, the children were symbols, not subjects. They were used to evoke pity, to sell charity, not to provoke change. It is easy now to criticize this, to ask why more journalists didn't go inside, why no one interviewed the children, why the silence lasted so long. But the truth is, few wanted to hear. A mad child challenges too much: the idea of innocence, the fantasy of progress, the comfort of believing we know who needs help and how to give it. The press reflected the society it served, and society by and large wanted the problem contained. Still, some cracks appeared. One article, unsigned, published in a reformist paper, read, "There are children in our institutions who need not be there. Not all are mad. Some are sad. Some are simply different, and we have given them to buildings instead of people." It was reprinted once, then forgotten. Another journalist wrote, "I asked a girl what she wanted. She said, to see grass every day." That line never left the margins of the column, but it stayed in the mind of the editor, who later donated to a special school. The press did not conspire to forget these children. It simply followed the logic of its time. What was visible became a story. What was invisible became the norm. And children in asylums, quiet, confined, unmourned, remained unseen. The next chapter will shift the focus, away from those who looked in, and toward those who tried to get out. Because even in silence, even in confinement, some children resisted, not always in words, sometimes in looks, in drawings, in escapes. They left traces, and those traces speak, even now. Not every corridor in the Victorian Asylum led to despair. There were pockets, rooms, people, moments where the architecture of suffering was interrupted, where someone imagined differently, where a door, just for a moment, opened in a new direction. Institutional innovations didn't come easily or often, but they came, and when they did, they left traces in reports, in policies, in the memories of those who passed through. Let's begin with education. By the 1870s, it became clear, even to administrators, that many children in asylums weren't mad in the medical sense. They were different, difficult, developmentally delayed. Some had epilepsy, some hearing loss. Others simply could not follow the rigid demands of a Victorian classroom. So, in a few institutions, schools were introduced. They were basic, often one room, few books, a blackboard, a bench, a bell. But for children who had been considered unteachable, they were revolutionary. Instructors began experimenting with simple literacy. Some children learned to write their names, others recited prayers or practiced arithmetic with pebbles. These weren't miracles, but they were windows. A child once labelled an idiot, now writing a letter home. A girl thought mute, beginning to hum the alphabet. At Darrenth Asylum in Kent, a more structured training system emerged. Children were grouped by ability, not age. Some were taught domestic skills, cooking, cleaning, sewing. Others learned simple trades. Boys repaired shoes. Girls folded laundry with precision. It was labour, yes, but it was also identity, purpose. Workshops appeared, printing presses, basket weaving tables, rug looms. These were not just chores, they were at times creative outlets. A boy who could not speak made intricate patterns in woven mats. A girl with seizures embroidered fabric with a delicacy no one expected. One doctor wrote, "They do not all need quiet. Some need stimulation, something to touch, to build, to finish." Innovations often depended on leadership. A new superintendent could change the rhythm of a ward, introduce music, reduce sedation, permit visits from outside choirs or charities. At Earlswood, records show an attempt at evening storytelling, a nurse reading aloud from scripture or fairy tales. Children who had never heard narrative outside of sermons now sat in rows, listening to Cinderella. Some institutions built gardens, not just for food, but for therapy. Children dug holes, planted seeds, watched growth. The logic was simple. To touch life was to feel alive. At Lancaster Moor, A small experiment allowed older children to visit nearby farms under supervision. They milked cows, gathered eggs. Some, briefly, lived with local families. The project was short-lived, concerns about liability shut it down. But for a time, it worked. The very idea that children could leave and return, could learn something useful, could be seen as more than defective, was radical. Other changes were quieter. Record-keeping improved. Inspectors began noting emotional states, not just behaviours. A child described as frequently tearful was for the first time not punished but given music time. At some sites, restraints declined. After public scrutiny and internal debate, straitjackets were phased out in select wards. Seclusion hours were shortened, cold baths reduced, even food changed, menus diversified, more fruit, less gruel, celebratory meals on holidays. A single apple, a sugared bun, a warm drink, small things, but for a child used to bland survival, they mattered. One girl reportedly whispered, after being given a piece of cake, "Am I in the wrong place?" Innovations extended to social connection. Some asylums allowed sibling visits, others began inviting volunteers, church groups, moral societies, student nurses. A boy might play checkers with a visitor. A girl might be given a donated scarf. These were gestures, symbolic, often, but to the child they were proof that the world had not entirely forgotten them. One of the most forward-thinking developments came with the Mental Deficiency Act of 1913. Though deeply flawed in its categorization, it pushed institutions toward differentiation. Children with mild disabilities were moved to training colonies. Some received ongoing education, others were considered for community placement. The shift was slow, limited, often underfunded, but it marked a change in philosophy, that not all children belonged in permanent care, that some could live, work, and grow beyond the walls. Not everyone embraced these changes. There was resistance. Staff feared chaos, parents feared failure, boards feared cost, but the best administrators, the most compassionate nurses, understood the truth, that a system built to contain could not also be expected to nurture. It had to be reimagined, and so they tried to paint the walls, tried to learn the names, tried to see the child, not the chart. It didn't always succeed. Some efforts collapsed, funding dried up, reforms reversed, but every attempt left a mark. A girl who learned to sew and later taught others. A boy who escaped, was returned, and then offered garden work instead of confinement. A ward where no child was restrained for a month for the first time. The innovations were imperfect, but they proved possibility, that even within a system of silence and severity, someone could imagine softness. And for the children, especially those who remembered the moment they were finally asked what they wanted, that mattered more than the outcome. The next section will look at those children, the ones who found a way to resist, not with rebellion, not always with words, but with presence, with art, with remembering who they were, even in the smallest way. Institutional innovation did not free them, but it lit a window, and for a child kept in the dark, one window can feel like a door. Laws like bricks build the walls of every institution, and in the Victorian and Edwardian eras, the legal foundations of the asylum system were laid with careful language, cold, administrative, but with the power to shape lives, especially the lives of children. From the early 1800s to the dawn of the 20th century, the legal apparatus around mental illness evolved rapidly. But reform did not always mean justice, and for children, progress was often slow, accidental, or incomplete. Let's begin with the earliest framework. The 1808 County Asylums Act allowed counties to build their own public asylums. It wasn't about compassion, it was about control. Before this, many people with mental illness were kept in prisons, workhouses, or hidden in homes. The law tried to centralize that population. It made no special mention of children. They were swept in with everyone else. Then came the 1845 Lunacy Act and the County Asylums Act, twin pillars of Victorian asylum expansion. They made asylums compulsory, required inspections, created the Lunacy Commission, which monitored standards and kept records. Again, children were not excluded. If a child was declared lunatic, idiot, or imbecile by two medical men, they could be committed indefinitely. No age minimum, no paediatric guidelines, no required re-evaluations. Commitment papers, once signed, had the force of incarceration. Some children entered at age 6, some never left. By the 1860s and 70s, pressure grew for reform, not because of children, but because of overcrowding, scandal, and cost. The Elementary Education Act of 1870 required children to attend school, but many asylum children were exempted, labelled as unfit to learn. Still, the law planted a seed. Education was now a right, at least in theory. Advocates began asking, should institutionalized children be educated too? Small changes followed. Some asylums added classrooms, others hired basic instructors, but there was no legal requirement, no protection. A child could still be confined, misdiagnosed, and left without schooling for life. The 1886 Idiots Act attempted to classify intellectual disabilities separately from mental illness. It created legal categories: idiot, imbecile, feeble-minded. The language was crude, the categories arbitrary, but it acknowledged at last that some children did not belong in psychiatric care. It was a start. The big turning point came in 1913, the Mental Deficiency Act. It created 4 categories: idiots, incapable of protecting themselves; imbeciles, capable of some self-care but not independence; feeble-minded, capable of education but socially defective; moral imbeciles, those whose conduct was judged abnormal. The Act allowed children to be placed in special institutions called colonies. These were meant to train, educate, and isolate. It was reform, yes, but it also reflected fear of degeneration, fear of poverty, fear of the child who would not fit into the Victorian mould. The law made it easier to separate these children from society, and while it did encourage alternatives to the asylum, it also cemented the idea that these children should be managed, not integrated. Under the Act, children could be committed by school boards, police, or local councils, not just doctors. Parental consent was not always required. Some children were helped, others disappeared into renamed institutions with the same old walls. The law said they would be educated, trained, prepared for work, but many received only routine, silence, and years behind gates. The Mental Deficiency Act remained in force until 1959. It influenced generations of practice. In 1930, the Mental Treatment Act finally introduced the idea of voluntary admission and outpatient care, but it mostly applied to adults. Children were still rarely asked what they wanted, or believed when they answered. Only in the post-war period did real reform begin. The 1944 Education Act guaranteed education for all children, including those with special needs. The 1946 National Health Service Act provided state medical care, slowly dismantling the old workhouse asylum pipeline. But even then, the legal culture of containment lingered. It wasn't until the Mental Health Act of 1959 that the term lunatic was officially abolished in law, and only then did the state begin to replace custodial care with community support. For children, that meant new schools, new therapies, new chances. But these changes came decades too late for many. The legal system that governed their lives was built on assumptions that they were broken, uneducable, burdensome, dangerous. It took a century to unwrite those assumptions. And even now, some linger, in the margins, in attitudes, in systems that still pathologize difference. Legal reform came in fragments, some driven by scandal, others by cost, a few by compassion. It is tempting to see the laws as progress, but each was also a boundary, a limit, a frame through which a child's life was interpreted. Was she defective or deficient? Could he work or not? Was she trainable or simply doomed? These questions weren't just medical, they were legal, and once answered, they shaped everything. From the clothes the child wore, to the bed they slept in, to the door they were or weren't allowed to walk through. The next chapter will look at the children who stepped beyond those lines, who found ways to resist, to survive, to speak, not because the law changed, but because they never forgot who they were. What happens after the gates close? Not the gates of the asylum, but the gates of childhood. What remains when a child raised behind stone walls becomes an adult? When the routines stop, but the echoes continue. The asylum for many children did not end. It simply changed shape. Some never left. They grew taller in the same beds, wore new uniforms, were moved from children's wards to adult ones. Their diagnosis aged with them. A girl labelled idiot at age 6 was still an idiot at 25. A boy admitted for moral imbecility became in time an institutional fixture, seen but no longer spoken of. Others were discharged. Into what? Some into workhouses, some into charity homes, a few into families who had once abandoned them, now too old or tired to care, fewer still into apprenticeships or community placements, experiments that sometimes worked and sometimes did not. The state kept records, some were readmitted, some disappeared, a few committed crimes and were sent to prison, already familiar with the structure. The transition was rarely gentle. A boy who had never handled money, expected to manage wages, a girl who had never cooked, asked to maintain a home, a young man who had never been touched with kindness, told to live among strangers. Many failed, not for lack of effort but for lack of preparation, and the outcomes stretched further still, into the mind, into the body. into every quiet room that reminded them of a locked one. Some lived with tics, with muteness, with phobias never named. Some could not sleep unless they heard a bell. Some feared doors left open more than doors closed. A woman who had spent her childhood at Earlswood wrote, years later, "When I left, I thought I'd be free, but I didn't know what to do without someone telling me where to stand." The institution trained obedience, but not agency, and when obedience was no longer demanded, many did not know how to replace it. The world outside had moved on. New laws, new diagnoses, new schools and systems. But the children who had grown up under the old ones were never quite invited in. They carried asylum within them. Some tried to speak. A few wrote memoirs, brief recollections, or gave testimony when later inquiries began. But most remained silent, or were not believed. Because by then, society had shifted. It wanted to forget. The asylum was becoming history, and history is easier to face when the living don't contradict it. Some sought work, in kitchens, in hospitals, in farms. They became caretakers, janitors, laundresses, roles that mirrored the ones they had played as children. Some married, some vanished, some never left the system at all, simply transferred from one building to another, their lives recorded only in census tallies and burial registers. And for the children who did not survive childhood, their outcomes were sealed early. Death in asylum records was often vague: failure to thrive, epileptic convulsion, cardiac arrest. Rarely were the causes examined, rarely were the names remembered, but the lingering effects were not only personal, they were generational. The families who lost children to the asylum often carried shame. The parents who signed forms never forgave themselves. The siblings who visited once and never again lived with questions they could not ask. And the institutions themselves. Some became museums, some were demolished, others turned into housing developments. The names changed, the stone remained. Today, you can stand where they stood, on old grounds now covered in gardens, in buildings now rented as flats, by trees planted a century ago, by hands too small to reach the top branches. The outcome lingers in silence, in the absence of names on walls, in the records sealed for privacy, in the lack of photographs, of graves, of stories told. But traces remain, in the behaviour of adults who once flinched at touch, in the drawing found in an old file, in the quiet bravery of those who refused to disappear. Some children resisted the roles assigned to them. They challenged staff, they escaped, they created art, they remembered, and some of those memories survived long enough to become testimony, enough at least for us to listen now. The final outcome is this: a story still unfinished, because the children who lived and died and endured inside those walls did not vanish. They shaped the laws that came after. They shaped the ethics of care. They shaped the language we use now when we speak of difference. And if we let them, they can shape how we remember. The next chapter will be the last, not an end, but a reflection on what it means to be forgotten and what it means to remember. There are stories that whisper when they should scream. The children of Victorian asylums were never supposed to be remembered. That was the design. Their diagnoses became labels. Their cries became symptoms. Their lives were measured in routines and reports, not memories, and yet they linger, in margins, in archives, in the minds of those willing to listen between the lines. This isn't just history, it's an ethical mirror, because when we look back at what was done to them, when we catalogue the misdiagnoses, the punishments, the quiet rooms, we're not only seeing a past system, we're seeing the scaffolding of beliefs that still echo. That children must be quiet to be good, that difference is danger, that systems know best. These children remind us what happens when institutions forget the individual, when care becomes containment, when behaviour becomes pathology, when poverty becomes a diagnosis. We read about them now and say, how could they? But the truth is, these children were made invisible because it was easier for families, for doctors, for governments, for newspapers, for neighbours, not because no one knew, but because knowing demanded action. And silence costs less. That is the ethical call, to refuse the silence, to name the children, to remember the lives behind the labels, to admit that intelligence, speech, obedience, these are not measures of worth. Every child confined in those asylums had a name, a fear, a favourite colour, a sound they liked, a memory that made them cry. Most of those details are lost, but some slip through. The girl who hummed when the window opened, the boy who carved a flower into a bench, the child who whispered, "I want to learn." Not grand rebellion, just presence, and that in itself was defiance. They were told they were nothing, and still, they remained. We live now in a world with better laws, better terms, better systems, but children still disappear into bureaucracy, into diagnosis, into silence. Some are over-medicated, some are mislabeled, some are locked away with new names, secure units, behavioral centres, therapeutic placements, different language, same danger. The children of the past demand that we ask better questions. What does care look like? Who gets to decide worth? What does it mean to listen, really listen, to someone who cannot speak the way we expect? They demand we confront the cold comfort of labels: deficient, incurable, dangerous, words that turn a person into paperwork, words that no child should ever carry alone. There is also something deeper here, not just ethics, but grief. Because when we truly sit with these histories, we feel what was taken. Not only lives, but possibilities. Who might they have been? What might they have created, loved, become? We will never know. And so we hold space for the unknown, for the children whose records end in single lines, died, transferred, no improvement. And we say, that is not enough. They deserved more. Not because they were exceptional, but because they were children. Because to be small and afraid and different is not a crime. It is simply human. There are ethical calls here for medicine, for education, for law, for society. But there is also a call to each of us, as individuals, to notice who is being silenced now, to resist the comfort of forgetting, to stay with the discomfort of remembering, because remembrance too is action. We cannot save the children who were lost, but we can refuse to let their erasure be complete. We can say their names if we find them. We can read their files with care. We can teach their histories. We can look at the photos when we are lucky enough to find them and say, you were here. Not a mistake, not a threat, not a burden, just here, alive, once, and worthy of being held in the memory of a world that once let you go. This is not the end of the story, because stories like these don't end. They echo. Every time a child is misunderstood, every time a system chooses efficiency over empathy, every time someone asks, what do we do with the ones who don't fit? And someone else answers, put them away. That is the moment we must remember the asylums, not as ancient history, but as warning and as promise that we can do better if we choose to listen.